Ever heard of a Bastion tenant? It's like the secret bunker for your admins, and it might be the missing piece in your zero trust strategy. Or maybe not. Or it could just be a holdover from on-prem habits, based on the legacy guidance from Active Directory. Now, in this episode, we'll unpack what a Bastion tenant really is, why some swear by it, and whether it still makes sense or whether it makes sense in today's cloud-native world. My name is Michael, I'm your host, and this is the Zero Trust Zone podcast. Today I'm joined by Thomas. For those who don't know Thomas, and I really doubt you do, he's been very active in the communities, in the Microsoft communities, and he's actually very active around Bastion tenants. But I'll leave that up to him to discuss later today. Hello, Thomas, and welcome for joining us here.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be a guest at your podcast.
It's always great to see you again, even though it's only been a short while that we've talked to one another in Germany. By the way, it was a wonderful conference. For those who don't know, it was the Cloud Identity Summit, and I attended for the first time, and I strongly suggest that if people haven't attended, they should next year.
Yeah, thanks for the great feedback. Last week, the week before, so 2 weeks ago we meet. Well, let's have a brief introduction of myself. So my name is Thomas Naunheim. I'm a cyber security architect at Glückania and also Microsoft security MVP for identity access and cloud security. And quite active in the community, mostly speaking on conferences and community events. And when it comes to Microsoft Entra, of course, everything related to security, identity security is close to my heart. But in particular, I spend a lot of time with topics around securing privilege, identity, and access. So that's also the reason why I spend a little bit time to research across the topic that you mentioned before, the Bastion forest, Bastion tenant, or as I name it, the red tenant.
Mm-hmm. So that brings up a really interesting part, right? Red tenants, Bastion tenant, Bastion forests. How did you come up with the red tenant name?
So I think in the past there has several people that use the name red tenant, but when I think about myself and how this topic started during my project, I can name it by a date because there was a time when I had a multi-tenant environment that I have to work with. And there were some B2C projects, and back to the days until today, when you're using customer identities with external identities or with the formerly known as Azure AD B2C, then you have a separated tenant. And if you are working in a large organization, you have to run also multiple tenants for staging. And during that time, I asked myself, hey, what will be the source of your identity? So where are their global admins coming from? And makes it sense to have the global admin in each of the tenants or have a centralized tenant where are their devices for privilege access and also the privilege identities are hosted. And that's the reason why I started in 2019 to have some early thoughts about how a red tenant, similar to the name like a red forest, could look like. And you already mentioned that in your introduction. Maybe it's an outdated concept and it makes no sense to build it in the cloud. But after some research, I figured out, hey, there are some good arguments, good benefits in having a red tenant. During that time, there was a lot of limitations that has now begun with all the cross-tenant access policies and some more support by Microsoft about a multi-tenant architecture. And in July 2020, so it's quite the 5th anniversary of the red tenant from my point of view, I have given a community talk at a community meetup to present the idea, what I have figured out so far, I know there are some other people in the community that worked on this concept as well. So it's not copyright by my own, but spent some years and time in this idea.
Okay, yeah. So I hear, it's obviously related to privileged access. So maybe before we dive into the concepts of, the Bastion tenant or the red tenant, I'll use red tenant because that's the name that you've given it. But can you share maybe a little bit, privileged access, right? It's a big attack factor, it's a big risk factor. But why is that, right? What are the typical challenges? Apologies. What are the typical challenges that you see in the real world? What kind of necessitates a different approach, like a red tenant, for instance?
So I think it has to be always a high risk factor when we're talking about privileged identities. Back in the days, when we think about Active Directory 15 or 20 years ago, there has to be also the challenge when you have a domain admin that has been used on a regular workstation, and there is something like a lateral movement past the hash attack surface that, for example, help desk or some lower privileged admins could gain credentials and then impersonate the domain admin, and then you have a lateral movement path. And a lot of people, when they started to move over to the cloud, they had in mind it's not needed anymore because there's no pass the hash and we have just-in-time access, and maybe I have still one identity, and with this work account, I can just request the global admin when I have to use them, and there's a limited time window for privilege assignment, and there is no need to have a separated identity or a separated device. But unfortunately, there's still an attack path or always attack surface, even in a cloud-only environment with Microsoft Entra, because as soon you're using a global admin role on a regular device, there's some footprints like token artifacts that will be stored on or cached on the device. And even if you're using phishing-resistant authentication methods like passkeys, there's still an increasing trend in post-authentication attacks, so that someone is stealing the artifacts that will be used to gain access to a resource. And if you have everything on the same device with the same identity, and even you started to separate them by browser profiles, each compromise of a regular workstation and maybe also a malicious Chrome extension could run into a compromise of your token artifacts and want to steal them, and then they will bypass conditional access and everything else. And so it's needed to have a full separation, in my opinion, and even separate privilege and regular assets within a tenant could be a high challenge. And there's also limitations by Microsoft, which enforces us, in my opinion, to have also a separated tenant, use the tenant boundary, and separate your workforce assets from the privilege assets.
So that's a very interesting, thought, because there's multiple elements coming together, right? So there's the workstation, and I think we'll talk about the privileged access workstations in a little bit as well, because they're quite intertwined. But then there's the tenant boundaries that you definitely are talking about. So given that we've done the introduction of the tenant boundary, the Bastion tenant or red tenant, sorry, to you, if you could explain it like I'm 5 years old, so explain to me like I'm 5. What is that red tenant, and what does that bring? Like that tenant boundary. Why is that specifically important, and should people care?
It will be your hard job to explain it like you're 5 years old, but let's imagine it would be your cloud control room, and this cloud control room is part of your house. And now everything related in the house has a dependency. And if someone outside of the room, which is still part of the building, could have impact of your secure control room, right? And even there's a separated door. There could be some people that hit the wall and make their own door alongside of the existing one. And there are people that can have impact on your electricity or something like that because you're still in the building. So you can do a lot of effort to secure the room, but in the end of the day, it's still part of your building. And our idea is to say, okay, you have a full separate building because there are also guests in your house that will be entering and leaving, and maybe you have a different security level in your private house compared to a high security building. And having it in a separated building with our own entry point, with our own control access part, and also people that ask if you are allowed to entering the building, it's much much more efficient to separate those ones. And even it's additional effort because you need to build a completely different building alongside of the existing one. I think that's a bit downside, the additional effort that you need to bring, but the quality of separation is on another level, in my opinion.
So, bringing it back to someone who's a little bit older than 5 years
Okay.
old, right? Two tenants. We're not in the same house. We're not sharing rooms. So that totally makes sense, right? Now, you did mention the element of, hey, it's quite a bit of extra work to set up that extra tenant. So when you take a look at everything that's available from a security perspective, what are the absolutely must-haves that you need to have in that red tenant in order to make sure that it is as secure as it can get, in order to make sure that it is reasonably secure, or if not a lot more secure, to govern other tenants, whether it's one or two or multiple ones?
Yeah. So first of all, the biggest mistake that you can do is recycling an existing tenant. So if you build a red tenant, you need to have a greenfield approach, have a completely brand new tenant without any legacy stuff included, without any hybrid synchronization stuff or something like that, without any stale applications with unused permissions or something like that. So create a brand new tenant. And I think the biggest challenge is you need to avoid lateral movement paths, because if you have, for example, a privileged admin workstation, a PAW, and you did all the investment in separated physical devices, separated users, but in the end, the help desk is still in a position to gain access to the devices, then you have an issue. And I think that's also the problem in many PAW projects in the past. Who takes care on admin devices? If it's still the same team like the endpoint guys, then they become also control plane tier 0, high critical, because they have still direct or indirect escalation path. So the other option is the identity team takes care on their own devices, but hey, the identity team is focusing on identity and have no deep skills in Intune, because therefore we have a Intune team or an endpoint team. So it's really a challenge who will maintain the tenant. And the other thing is you don't like to have the global admin for your workforce tenant becomes also global admin in the red tenant, because otherwise you have no shared responsibility, because you are the owner of the building and have full access to everything, but you like to restrict those people that have access in this high secure building. So that's the reason that I had the pleasure to work with colleagues at Clucania on our managed service, and we decided to establish a shared responsibility model, that you have a second party that takes care on all the monitoring, all the configuration on best practices. But this authority or party is not in the position to have a full access and doing all the stuff with full control without any review or something else by the customer, so by the workforce tenant owner. And we achieved the goal by following a strict as code approach. So everything in the red tenant is written in code. And if there's a change, for example, conditional access needs to be updated because there's a new feature by Microsoft, we will make this change written in configuration as code. And the other party, so the customer, is in the position to review the change. They are able to see that we are not doing any backdoor stuff or bad evil stuff. And after the review, there's a four eyes approach, and this change will be applied by a pipeline, by a DevOps approach. And I think this is also really important for people that like to build a red tenant. You really like to go the way of S code, because then you have the way to track what are the changes. You have a way to restore configuration changes. And there's also not a single person or party that can modify everything in the red tenant. So not one party that will be maybe compromised is also leading into a compromise of the red tenant. And that's, for example, for us as Clucania, as a MSSP of the red tenant, really important that we can say, okay, the red tenant is still not 100% in our control. And even if there's a supply chain attack, that will not affect the customer red tenant.
Okay. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? It also adds, in my opinion, but it warrants a good discussion, a lot of overhead. So you've got the customer's tenant, you've got a red tenant, then you've got your MSSP tenant, I imagine, through which you're doing lots of stuff. And not a single person has access anywhere. Well, obviously someone has to have global admin, but when you take a look at that, the complexity goes up tremendously. You did mention as a code, while I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that should be the goal. I really wonder how feasible this is for many organizations. Now, it's a great selling point for why you have a red tenant service. So I think that's one of the good reasons why you would work with an MSSP like you. But doesn't it kind of put the bar really high for many organizations? And is that maybe the reason why we're not seeing more of these red tenants across the world?
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, it's still the question if you as an organization that maybe spend not the main business with running IT, right? For example, you're an insurance company or you're in the manufacturing industry or something like that. So the big point is, do you have the capacity, the resources to run something like that? So in my opinion, it's really hard. As I already mentioned, you need to have a shared responsibility model with who takes care on the PAW, and maybe that could be also the Intune team, but they should have separated persona. So if they are still the same person that is doing the job, they have to be for managing the regular enterprise devices in the persona role as a management plane, workload plane admin. And if they are starting to maintain the PAW, they become control plane and have to use also PAW and VR control plane. So there are some ways to do it also without being 100% in a as code approach. You can also have something like an approval for every PIM request that you run into the red tenant, for example. But in the end of the day, it's it's just a balance between you reduce the number of automation and security, and you have more manual work, and the people that already run your IT infrastructure, on top of it, they have a separated environment that they need also to spend time and updating and all this stuff. So yeah, of course, it's a high effort, and therefore we are more than happy to offer a managed service for that one. But yeah, it's not for every small organization a goal to run a red tenant by their own. I think that makes no sense, because otherwise there will be misconfiguration, or they are not following a strict tiering model in the red tenant, and then you have no benefits if you bypass the policies in your own environment.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I do think there's a threshold, not just in terms of size of the organization, but also risk profile, like, very high secure environments, governments, and so forth and so on. They can definitely benefit from that. So I think we're clear on that. But there's two more elements that kind of triggered me while you were explaining this. So first of all, you said, well, if you're using the same team, then you have to have two personas, right? But at the end of the day, it's still the same person, right? So you're going to have multiple accounts, multiple devices, maybe, regular device, privileged access workstation, all the things that we would expect in such a situation. However, from an identity management perspective, that does generate a challenge, because the challenge of governing identities. How about automations of linking that personal account to the admin account in a different tenant, and then ensuring that if someone leaves the organization, their privileged access account living in a different tenant, a red tenant, for instance, are automatically disabled. Is that for you a no-no because you do create a bridge? Or is it more the, yes, you absolutely have to reduce that risk of forgetting to disable or remove accounts?
So I think we need to separate between you have a dependency with the information that someone is join mover or in a leaver position, and is the system in the position to apply the changes. So what I would always avoid is that you have a identity governance or entitlement system like SailPoint, for example, and you have a connection directly to the red tenant, and the SailPoint application is able to create, modify, and delete red tenant users. That makes no sense because then you're bridging the stuff. But on the other side, we have this challenge nowadays, even without a red tenant. Would you really like to have SailPoint as a privileged authentication admin or privileged user that can create a global admin? And what I did in the past is to say, okay, it's SailPoint or an HR system or call it whatever you like, is still the source of truth. We're collecting the information about the employee from this source, but the whole provisioning, deprovisioning, and lifecycle process will be natively executed in Entra, because then you have no dependency with third party. That's a core feature of Entra ID governance. And we can make sure that only a global admin or other high privileged roles are able to modify this provisioning or lifecycle process. And people with those privileges can also abuse them directly, so they don't need to compromise the provisioning flow. So in the past, there would be a good idea to say, okay, there will be some people joining the company. They have a flag like part of the IT department, and by default they get a privileged user as a separated user, but without zero standing access, and by default no privileges. So they have no birth right to become automatically a global admin. There is fully separated from the identity provisioning process and then the title management, that after they onboarded their PAW, after they are able to use strong authentication by using passkeys, they can request a persona role, and there's always a similar privileged role. So another global admin that approved the request. And the same approach can be done in the red tenant. So the red tenant is using the HR system or any identity mastering directory to get the HR information, and based on these joiner, leaver, mover details, they are starting to manage the life cycle of the identities. Then you have a split in the escalation path as well.
Well, absolutely. As soon as you have the multiple accounts and making sure there's one or two levels of approval at some point, then yeah, you make it harder. I mean, there's still the risk of, but at the end of the day, it's a lot harder. Okay, so we've mentioned it a couple of times so far. If you do a red tenant, then please do a privileged access workstation. And that in itself could be an entire episode of 50 Shades of how do we do this. Now, I can imagine that in relation to a red tenant or a Bastion tenant, people kind of wonder, what is the best approach? I think we can squash the bug and make sure that, yes, it has to be a physical device if you really want to be absolutely secure. How do you feel about the in-between option of, well, if you can do a physical device, or is it it's too cost restrained, go for a virtual one? Do you see that as an good enough approach, or more it doesn't really make any sense at all because of X, Y, Z?
So first of all, totally agree. So if you are a control plane tier 0 admin, so if you using a global admin role, there's no that should be a PAW user. So having a clean keyboard approach, as Microsoft name it, having full separated device. And honestly, I guess there are not thousands of users in the organization that should have the global admin role. So it's really important to analyze your privileges in the environment to figure out who are your critical assets, who is really the high privileged users in your environment, and then decided that they should become a PAW user. If there are people that say, no, I don't like to have a PAW, but they are still like to use a global admin, I think then we have a discussion, because on the other hand, there could be also the option that they follow more the least privilege approach, and maybe they don't need the global admin for everyday use. But it's really important, and that is what I have seen over the years in many projects. It's really important to have an acceptance of what you are doing with a red tenant or a PAW. And it makes maybe from a security standpoint sense to have 100% coverage. Everybody is using a clean keyboard approach. But if the people don't use that or try to find a workaround or still using their the previous admin accounts or work accounts for doing administrative tasks, I think it's worse than any alternate option from a PAW. And I'm not a big fan of jump hosts. So the idea to have something like a virtual machine in Azure and then accessing those devices from the regular workstation. But fortunately, there are some ideas how you can increase the security by using Azure Virtual Desktops and also restrict what are the ways to accessing an Azure Virtual Desktop. And for example, in the managed red tenant from Clucania, we have the approach about the VAW, which is also powered by an Azure Virtual Desktop running in the red tenant. So it's really important that also your virtual admin or workstation are part of the high restricted isolated red tenant. And we have integrated global secure access to have a pre-authentication, collecting more signals from the accessing device and user. And that brings an additional layer of security if you're using AVD for privileged access. And for us, it's a question about increasing security and also have a way to scale with a virtual admin workstation compared to a physical device. And for management plane or workload plane admins, so people that use privileges for managing workloads, it could be a good enough option and much better than running a browser profile on the device that you are using for email, internet access, and other stuff. So even the separation and having the virtual desktop as an admin endpoint have some benefits, but in the end, you must make sure that you make it hard for an attacker that if the client has been compromised, there's no option that the attacker can stolen artifacts to jump on the Azure Virtual Desktop. And that was one of the things where we spent a lot of time and energy to find a good solution for. And that was really a hard part.
Well, it's not an easy problem to solve, right? And it kind of brings some thoughts to what you just said because of the acceptance part, right? What I don't get, and it's probably preaching to the choir here, is that we're in IT. Our job is to do security, and a lot of the people I talk to, they are very resisting to the fact that I need a second device or I need this, and oh no, I don't want to do that. Even though that when you compare it to real life, it's the yellow hat that you wear on a construction site, right? It's the thing that saves you if something falls down. But the privileged access workstation is our yellow hat.
We should hat, actually, right?
yeah, no, exactly, right. So that's why I use it as an analogy quite often, because to my point, it should be a law that says if you're a global admin, you have to have a privileged access workstation, just as there are laws that say when you walk into a construction yard, you have to have that hard hat because, you could otherwise be in big trouble. Now, aside from that, little anecdote, I think there is another element, and it's a little bit of a curveball, so don't hate me for it, but you mentioned, okay, so, there's different levels of trust, right? Maybe for a workload admin, we can do the virtual workstation, and it's a good enough approach. So how do you feel about, isolated browser access elements, privileged access solutions that kind of use that same principle, like a Beyond Trust or a CyberArk that use their solutions for privileged access versus a clean PAW? What's your take on that?
So I'm not a big fan of PAM solutions that be, I will describe it in a bad way, and would say is a man in the middle, because mostly all the privilege access will be orchestrated by their session proxy or by their session host. And I'm a big fan of zero trust, so I like to see the original signals from the device and the user. And it's quite important to take benefit on the signals. So we have the beautiful MDE signals about machine risk. We have device compliance and so on. We have with global secure access the way of universal continuous access evaluation to interrupt near real time if there's something going wrong. And without these signals directly from the accessing device and having all connections from your global admin by a Windows server, which is running CyberArk's session proxy. I have no idea how the official term name or notion is for that, but I have seen that many times they have such an approach like the man in the middle. And that would be another way to abuse, right? Because you have centralized everything on this machine, similar to Azure Virtual Desktop, when everything with the management plane access is located on Azure Virtual Desktop. You need also make sure that you have a secured environment for AVD as well. But in the end of the day, for me, the golden rule is having full visibility on the original signals from the accessing device, accessing user. And a lot of features that Microsoft is developing nowadays requires also that you have the direct access from the endpoint and not having something in the man between.
So I think that's a really interesting approach, because and I'm with you on this one. And no, it's not because I'm a Microsoft fanboy, because I'm just as easily an Apple fanboy. I love technology. What can I say? But I do think that you're absolutely right. Right? Adding additional solutions creates complexity or creates additional attack vectors, because even though that Microsoft has their bugs in their software as well, adding another party, and we've seen that in the past, right, where third parties are breached, they may immediately provide an entry point. But yet, lots of organizations, especially highly secured ones, they kind of standardize on certain solutions for privileged access, and that kind of creates that, we're right in front of one another. So I think you made some really great points in terms of the manageability, but monitoring capability or traceability of what you're doing. So that's good to hear. So, kind of slowly wrapping up things here a little bit. I heard you say things like privileged identity management. I heard you say, authentication. I heard tokens, FIDO2 keys. I heard you say at some point, Entra Global Secure Access. Is this really where, to your opinion, identity security is heading, right? Where we're really combining everything the best of IT has to offer in order to create the most secure manner? Or are we just artificially trying to make things harder for ourselves? Because, at the end of the day, first of all, licensing wise, it's like, you need a full E5, and then you need the Entra suite, and then you need XYZ. So it becomes kind of expensive. It becomes quite technical. And again, I'm trying to understand, maintainability, achievability, because obviously we want as much people to do the right thing as possible. So what's your take on that?
So I think when you're comparing such a solution, you must also be honest to yourself. What are the current efforts in doing this stuff? Not only about the risk that you're currently facing on, also about your efforts. Most people that have separated accounts, what they're doing nowadays is having a script and doing all the on and offboarding manually and having no automation for that one. And if I ask the people, what will be happen in a disaster recovery case? Can you really restore some misconfigurations back to today? So a lot of stuff that you can do with the red tenant, and it forces you to do, like separated tenant that is managed as code, bringing global secure access for extending your visibility of signals. I think that gives a lot of power that you will not have if you still use everything on your regular device. And for me, one of the good things when we're talking about security monitoring, from my point of view, it will become much easier with a red tenant and with a clear access path from a red tenant to monitoring any suspicious access, because it becomes clear that a global admin is coming from a PAW from the red tenant by using a managed red tenant or a red tenant user by using passkeys, and that's the way that is the authorized access path. And everything between is already suspicious. So there's also some good side effects, how I can say that, allows you to be more efficient and build more easier detections, and also analyze the access and attack paths. And that is something which is a big benefit. And if you still stay with your workstation that will be used for administration, it becomes hard for you to separate and identify what is regular access, what is the privilege access. And in the end of the day, I think you should have a monitoring for your privilege access, and that becomes quite complicated if you are not having this approach. So yeah, there's a lot of work. We push a lot of technology on the table to achieve the goal. But in the end, there's also benefits which reduce the effort in monitoring and also in posture management, from my point of view.
I imagine, based on what you just said there, some people might have a question about that monitoring bits and pieces. So, having a separate red tenant for identity and access management into other environments, totally makes sense. From a monitoring perspective, making sure that you monitor the source tenant and the red tenant, obviously, yes. But how about how to do the monitoring in let's say that you're an MSSP, right? We've got a red tenant and I'm monitoring multiple customers, right? Or I'm a large organization and I have a red tenant because I want to manage my, multiple tenants I may have in my environment, or even if I just have one operational tenant. Would you say that it is absolutely necessary to have the logged data of the regular tenant shipped to the Bastion or red tenant because it's the most secure part? Or would you do the Sentinel federated kind of model where you just have a view of what's already in that originating tenant?
No, I think it makes still sense to keep the logs in the corresponding tenant. I think there's, for example, I'm also not a big fan if you're starting to have a MDI monitoring of domain controllers in a red tenant, because you mentioned that as a tier 0 control plane system. So everything should be still in relation to the corresponding tenant. However, it's really important what you mentioned about the visibility. So I like to see from the red tenant what are the accessing paths of my red tenant users, and also correlate the signals to one place. So that gives you another opportunity. Even someone has compromised the red tenant and try to turn off Sentinel, try to turn off the lights for the SOC. You should have also the visibility from the red tenant and see there's something going on there, and having a second peers of eyes that takes care on the red tenant, and also tracks your maturity and your adoption, because you really there's a journey, of course. If you go the way with the red tenant, you have to move the accounts and the users to the way of consuming your new identities and devices from the red tenant. And with this visibility in the red tenant, you can see, is there maybe one colleague that try to backdoor themselves and try to make persistence because he or she likes to hate using the PAW. So everything comes together with reporting and monitoring, which is a very important aspect of the red tenant.
Yet another thing to consider, as you said, there's many moving pieces, but they are, checking the box. Yep, I have to do everything. Hey, one more thing before, the closing thoughts here. You did mention earlier the different levels of trust, right? Maybe workloads admins have a little bit less, less need for a paw. I do know that you have that framework that you created about, privileges and what are high privileges. Is that what you would suggest that people use as hey, if you want to determine whether it's actually a paw user or not a paw user, kind of refer back to your own documentation? And I know it's a little bit of a plug, but I'll give it to you anyway.
Yeah. You mentioned the project Enterops. So Enterops is not only about classification; it is also a PowerShell module which analyzes the environment. And for many, my feedback from the community and customers is this offers really a turn on the lights moment, because before they maybe not aware about the criticality of their application admin. And even it's not only about the role, it's also about the scope. So if you have, for example, a group administrator and a group admin of a M365 or just about some lower privilege group would be not high efficient. But what about group that will be used for granting domain controllers permission in Azure or giving you full control in Intune RBAC? So Entra-Ops tries to classify every object and also direct or indirect assignment. And for me, it's the first step of a red tenant journey to analyze your existing environment. What are the high privileged users? What are the people that move over to the red tenant? And are there still some other identities that needs to be migrated? And it's part of a continuous monitoring process, because what I've seen in ESAEs or Active Directory tiering projects many years ago, you do a perfect project, introducing a red tenant, make everything clean as it is, and you leave as a consultant or as an IT guy the project, and after 5 years you come back and nobody is using the red tenant. Everybody starts the day after you leave the office, the separated accounts in the original place in the resource tenant or in the workforce. So strictly monitoring is also a key aspect, and some tools like Entra-Ops, but also attack path analysis tools like Bloodhound or exposure management helps a lot to keep your eyes on this asset.
Well, great. And for the listeners, I will add the links to that documentation and Entra-Ops obviously as well in the notes, so make sure to check them out. So I think I have one more question for you before we wrap things up finally here. Thomas, if there is one more piece of advice other than start with the Entra-Ops bits and pieces, maybe a personal pain that you've felt throughout your journey of red tenants, what would that be?
Please consider your non-human identities. We talk a lot about BAW and users, and it's a really pain point and mostly a finding in every assessment that you should take care on your service principals, especially about those ones with high privileges. And please do try to achieve a similar security standard for your non-human identities. And that's, I think, really important to mention alongside of introducing a red tenant.
It just feels like we have to have another episode just talking about application governance. You just kind of created episode 4, application governance. There we go. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today, Thomas. I really appreciate the time. I think our guests will definitely appreciate that as well. And I have the feeling that it won't be the last time that we see you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, my pleasure. Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.